Welcome to Beast TV. So you think you have all the answers and facts? Think again. You better get you a fresh dip and buckle up. Well, doggy, we are in for a treat tonight, Larry Ports II.
No doubt about that. Our guest tonight, from beginning to now, has lived a Bigfoot-rich life, I'd say.
I tell you, I'm just so excited to have Doug Schrader on, and he's one of the nicest guys that are in this community, and I love him and Linda both to death, and I'm just so excited to be able to talk about our history and the knowledge that has been learned over the years, and I'm just excited.
Oh, I agree. Like I said, this journey he's fixing to lead us on, the people he's met and the things that have led him to those people, it's just an amazing story to hear, and just the people in this story are amazing to know about. Besides Doug being the amazing guy he is, I mean, like you said, him and Linda are salt of the earth people. So, we went up before we went to LBL this last week, and we kept social distance because we didn't want Doug getting sick or Linda, which we weren't sick, but nowadays you just don't know with this virus that's supposedly carried and you don't have symptoms. So we were careful, and Doug gave us a lot of Bigfoot literature, DVDs, and even a special cast that he was given that he'll talk about later. But we need to quit taking up time because Doug's got an awesome story to tell.
Well, I tell you, why don't you go ahead and introduce him?
Well, our guest tonight is Doug Schrader, and welcome to the show, Doug. How are you doing?
Hey, Larry and Mark. I'm doing great. I really appreciate it, and I have to tell you, I'm thrilled to be on the #1 podcast on this subject in the whole country.
Doug, your check is in the mail.
Hey, couldn't be on with two better guys. That's all I can say.
Oh, me. Doug, we first met a few years ago when I was speaking at the Arkansas Bigfoot Conference. And I have come to lean on your 50-plus years of knowledge and expertise of researching the researchers. But before we get started, I'd really like for you to introduce yourself and give us some background of where you grew up in your early years.
Absolutely, Mark. I'd be happy to. And by the way, when we first did meet, it was in Arkansas in 2018 at the Bigfoot conference, the first time I'd gone to that one, and it was a pleasure. And you did a terrific job, by the way, on your presentation. But
thank you.
To move things forward, my family are actually immigrants from Germany, came to the United States in the 1800s, mid 1800s, and moved into southern Minnesota. They were basically farmers. And then my mother and father were both raised in Minnesota, and my father joined the Army, and during World War II was combat medic. And then in 1949, when my mother was 6 months pregnant with me, and my dad had just finished his metallurgical engineering degree after the war, he was hired by a big steel mill in Northwest Indiana, and they moved down there. And I was actually born in 1949 up in Northwest Indiana. And my father, was outdoorsman. He was a hunter. He was a fisherman. So he moved us east along the southern shore of Lake Michigan to a wonderful community that I had a great pleasure to being raised in through my, not only my childhood years, but my teenage years as well. And the community is called Chesterton, Indiana. Some of you may know that area along the southern shore of Lake Michigan, but it's now our nation's newest national park, having been named the 61st national park about not quite 2 years ago now. But I had the pleasure of being raised there. And like most young boys back in the 50s, we didn't have all the toys and gadgets and gizmos that young kids have today. We pretty much had to entertain ourselves. And, I spent a lot of time collecting frogs and lizards and snakes and, the whole 9 yards, and riding my bike out to the dunes. And that was all forest at that time along the lake. It's been a little bit more developed since then. And always kind of had a really keen interest in just biology, life sciences, those kinds of things. And then when I was a 7th grader growing up in Chesterton, the couple that lived behind my folks he was a mortician with no children. And he had known that I had this interest in life sciences, and he'd asked me if I'd ever be interested in someday maybe becoming a mortician and working for him at his funeral home. And I told him at that time that I'd sure give it a shot. So from 7th grade all the way through my senior year in high school, I actually got hands-on training with him, and as a mortician and mortician assistant, with the full intent of going off to mortuary science school at his expense, by the way, in Chicago. But as things turned out, I had kind of had a bad experience right there in my last part of my senior year. And so I changed plans, and I decided to go off to Ball State University. And so some of you online that may have heard of Ball State, it's a large university in Muncie, Indiana, kind of about an hour northeast of Indianapolis. And I had a great experience there. It was a wonderful opportunity, great opportunity for a really solid, good education. But then Uncle Sam kind of came calling. And in 1969, I was drafted, as were hundreds of thousands of other soldiers, to participate in the war in Southeast Asia. And so I did that. And that was when I look back on all of that, that was a key moment in my lifetime, because most of the soldiers that were being drafted at that time out of the Chicago metro area were going typically to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, but they had an outbreak of spinal meningitis at that time. And our whole group, for several months, actually, we got sent to Fort Lewis, Washington. And my first foray out into Washington State and that part of the country, and it was an amazing experience for me. The irony of the whole thing was, when you're in the Army and you get off we landed at Seattle Tacoma International Airport, and of course the drill sergeants all met us there, threw us on the bus, took it to Fort Lewis, and for 2 months I didn't see anything. And it was in November and December, man. I mean, it was raining, cold, cloudy, snow half the time, but every now and then I got a little peek, and there was this beautiful mountain I could see. So I thought that was pretty cool. And it turned out one of the guys that I was in basic training with was from Spanaway, Washington, which is right there by Tacoma. And he said, "Doug, if we don't go to Vietnam immediately," he said, "you and I are going to make a weekend trip to go up to Mount Rainier." And I said, "I'm all in." And as it turned out, out of our company, there was maybe 8 of us, for some reason, didn't go immediately overseas. Wow. And I actually stayed at Fort Lewis for a year, and he did too. So that kind of led me, to the next steps in my whole experience, with the interest in Bigfoot and those kinds of things. So I can talk a little bit more about that for sure, here. And
yeah, go ahead and start the journey on your Bigfoot path.
I sure will. So yeah, basically what had happened, when I was younger, my father, he would get National Geographic magazine, and he was an outdoorsman, Field and Stream and all that. I used to love to go to the barbershop with him, because back in the 50s and 60s, man, all the barbers had all the magazines laying out there. You'd see the pictures of the hunters and the bears, and every now and then there'd be an article about the Yeti and the Himalayas, and maybe a story about Bigfoot. But so I was aware of all that. My senior year in high school was a Sentinel event that took place, in 1967 with the Patterson-Gimlin film. Actually, I should back up a little bit. I was actually even aware of the Jerry Crew, episode that happened in the 50s. I was younger then, but certainly was well aware of what happened in 1967. So kind of filed that away, and like I said, got into the Army and did all that. And my buddy, as it turned out, said to me, "Hey, Doug, let's fulfill our promise that we had in basic training, and let's go up to Mount Rainier." So we left. It was early. I would say it was probably late spring. I know there was still some snow on the ground, but temperatures were getting warmer, and we left out of Fort Lewis and took Highway 7, I think it is, and started heading up to the Longmere entrance into Mount Rainier National Park. And along the way, right when it was starting to get, light, we pulled in a little town, and I want to say it's Elba. I haven't been there for a long time, but I believe that's the name of a little bitty community mountain town. We had to get some gas and about time to get a bite to eat. So my buddy and I were sitting in there and having some breakfast, and there's two fellas in the booth right next to us. I mean, it was tight quarters. I could hear every word they were saying, and they both those guys were in their 50s, maybe 60. But you could tell they were long in the tooth as far as being loggers, and they were mountain men and the whole 9 yards. And they started talking about some experiences that they had been having, very similar to the stories some of your audience may have read when they read about Jerry Crew and how, they were cutting logging roads back up into the wilderness. And they had also experienced a bunch of gigantic footprints, barefooted footprints, let's put it that way. So I'm, the thing that struck me, and I'm listening to this for like 10 minutes, and I'm like dialed in now, you can imagine, but so it really struck me because it was just such normal casual conversation with those two guys. So I finally kind of politely said, hey guys, I'm listening to your conversation. I don't mean to be butting in, but are you guys like really serious? I mean, this is for sure. And the guy says, where are you from, son? And I said, well, I'm from Northwest Indiana, along the southern shore of Lake Michigan. And I'll never forget, he says, well, do you have rabbits in Northwest Indiana? And I said, we sure do. And he says, well, we have Bigfoot here. Who was I to argue, right? And, so my buddy and I, we ended up talking to these guys for another half an hour. And it was a tremendous experience for me because they were really kind of the first guys that I ever really met that, had some genuine experiences back in the woods. And then, I fast forward, go to Vietnam, did my thing over there, and then came back in 1972. And I immediately went back to Ball State University to try to finish my undergraduate degree at that time. And lo and behold, I originally was a biology major before I got drafted. And when I got back, the counselor said, hey, there's a great field opening up in earth and geological sciences. Why don't you switch your major? So I actually did. I switched to becoming a earth science major and then made biology my minor. But to that regard, I was taking that very first semester back from overseas, I was taking a biology course, and professor was talking about primate evolution. And back in those days, everyone totally believed, and a lot of people still do today, unfortunately, that it was just a straight line, linear progression as how we evolved to become Homo sapiens. And the professor started talking about all that stuff with us. And like at that time, I think I was still 22. I don't think I'd turned 23 yet, but he was probably in his mid 40s, I'm guessing. And he happens to mention right towards the end of the class, and then there's this fossil evidence of Gigantopithecus. And he starts talking about Gigantopithecus, which I honestly was not aware of, but it caught my attention, of course. And then, like, his last parting words before the class ended was, and for those of you that are really want to be out on the proverbial limb, if you would, you know, there's this belief that many have, primarily our Native American population, in a creature that's called Sasquatch or Bigfoot. And boy, did that ring a bell with me, as you could imagine.
Yeah.
So yeah, I took that opportunity as soon as everybody left the classroom and went up and started talking to the professor. And I told him my story about, you know, being out at Fort Lewis and what had happened there. And as luck would have it, it was another one of those things that, to a great extent, you know, changed my life. Is he actually knew Grover Krantz. And now keep in mind, this is back in late 1972, early 73. And he said, you know, Grover would love to hear your story. He's a great guy. I know him really well. He says, how about I give you his address, and I'll even give you his phone number, and just tell him, you know, that Professor so-and-so said to reach out to him. So I wasn't too shy back in those days, especially when it came to this kind of a subject. So I actually did that. And, you know, it was very expensive to make a phone call back in the days. We didn't have cell phones, you know, it was like $1 a minute and stuff. So I originally wrote him a letter, and just as nice as I could be, not honestly expecting that I would get an answer, because he was kind of the guy back at that time. I mean, he was the guy from a scientific perspective. He was really the only guy back in those days that had that kind of a background that was taking this whole subject serious. But anyhow, I wrote him this really nice letter, told him who I was, that I had this interest, told him about my experience. And the next thing I know, he called me. And I had given him my phone number, and we had about a 5-minute chat, you know, and it just started my whole experience with him. And I had, from that point forward, I kept with Grover, not a lot. He was a busy guy. And of course, you know, after I graduated, I had a young family and was working and doing things, but always kept the interest. But, you know, we would probably hear from each other once or twice a year, mostly through written letters. And he took it upon himself, being the quintessential educator that he was, to kind of take a young guy like me under his wing, who was expressing a lot of interest. I never passed judgment on anything he said. You know, at that time I was reading everything I possibly could, but in that regard, he was the one that I'll never forget him telling me. He recommended a number of initial books that I read. And actually, I think I have one of them right here. This was one of the ones. This is by John Napier, and it was called Bigfoot, the Yeti, Sasquatch in Myth and Reality. It was one of the first books that I read. And I don't know if you haven't read it, if you're interested in the subject, I think you can still find them in the library. But and one of the things that he had told me to do, he said, Doug, not only when you read these books, but look at the references. And he said, follow those references. Now, again, remember, this is back in the early 70s. We have no computers. You know, we don't have that kind of technology. I was very fortunate at that time, because Ball State had just built a massive new library on campus, had over 1 million volumes of material in print, but it also had a massive microfilm library. And you could go back and look at all of this stuff. And I was, in most cases, able to go back and look at old magazine articles and old newspaper articles from all over North America. I mean, a lot of them even going back into the 1800s. So I think it was that exercise, and the fact that you had to put a lot of sweat equity into it, but you got a lot out of it, because it forced you, and to, you know, if I was going to follow his lead and stuff, that forced me to do that hard work to really get as much knowledge and information and bring myself up to speed on that subject as fast as I could. And I would tell you, it never ended. So, to a great extent, I'm still doing all that.
You know, the history is just something that I am fascinated about. And just to give an example, I remember about 4 or 5 years ago, Jim King, Cheryl Corntassel, and myself were invited to come to the Sasquatch Museum in Cherry Log, Georgia.
Oh, yeah, I've been there.
Yeah, it's really nice. And we were invited to come there to hang out with Mr. Bob Gimlin.
Awesome.
And so, you know, while we were waiting on Mr. Gimlin to finish his meet and greet, I was just strolling around and talking to folks, and I came upon the researchers timeline wall. And I'm sure you remember that.
Yep, I sure do.
There were pictures of people and their bios and their accomplishments. And I was overwhelmed with the folks that I have never heard of, but their contributions really laid the foundation for what we are doing today.
Absolutely, Mark. You said it very, very well. And I would echo those sentiments wholeheartedly, because when I was reflecting back actually and doing some preparation for the program tonight, I started digging back into my archives and things like that. And lo and behold, I uncovered some documents I hadn't seen in 43 years, believe it or not. So one of those was I'll hold it up, not that probably the audience can see it too much, but this was called Bigfoot News. And this is what Peter Byrne started to do in the 1970s. So I think most people would know who Peter Byrne is, but if not, you know, he was a famous big game hunter and still is alive today. Terrific guy. You know, one of the real pillars in the beginning of this whole quest. And going back and looking through these, scanning these just real quickly, you know, it was a simple monthly 4-pager that he would put out, but it was chock full of information. But he was one of the first, matter of fact, probably the first guy that I can think of that ever tried to do anything like this. He was also one of the first guys that I know of that actually started to network a little bit and find folks. He obviously needed people, you know, they were focused on the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia, obviously back in those days. And he realized that he needed some help in trying to investigate, because he established along the Columbia River, just west of the Dalles in Oregon, on the Oregon side of the river. It was actually just kind of a little makeshift trailer in the beginning, but it was his Bigfoot Research Center. Not that a whole lot of people knew about it, but what he started to do was network with law enforcement, and slowly over time, the word had gotten out. He was pretty proactive with some of the local media and stuff. Again, keeping in mind, no internet, nothing like that back in those days. So, you know, news didn't travel that fast. It was tough for anybody that was not in the Pacific Northwest but had an interest in this subject like myself. You would have had a very hard time. You know, you get lucky now and then, and maybe the Chicago paper or Indianapolis or one of the bigger cities papers would put a 2-paragraph blip on the back of the newspaper. You know, it wasn't front page material for the most part, but he changed all that. And he really started to get out there and to reach out, started doing educational things. He even got to the point where he was traveling around the country a little bit. So I give him a heck of a lot of credit for being one of the first guys to do that. And it was kind of ironic. Some of you may know, and matter of fact, I've only met this fellow one time, and it was later in 2003, but a guy named Rick Knoll. And I was looking through some of these old publications. These go back to in the 70s, and Rick Knoll happened to be one of the guys that was doing field investigation and follow up on sightings on behalf of Peter. And I didn't know that until just the other day. And I met him in 2003. And many people know he was closely associated with the Skookum Cast expedition and all that kind of stuff back in 2000. But just kind of funny. And I'm going to definitely take some time here while we're all kind of social distancing and read back through a lot of these old newsletters and refresh my memories on that. But yeah, definitely Peter Byrne was one of those guys, as was Grover Krantz. And I mean, those guys are the beginning. And I would tell anyone that really has a interest in the subject and a passion, like so many of us do, like I've had for well over 50 some years now, that you owe it to yourself to take the time and go back and do the research and find who those original, I'll call them pioneers, the people who led the pack in all of this, because it's a fascinating story. It just really is. And if it wasn't for folks like that, we wouldn't be where we are today. I would tell you, something else too, that I've often told a lot of folks. We spoke a little bit about Grover and how gracious Grover was to me. I mean, I was just some guy, in Indiana. He didn't have to, take the time, and he was a busy guy and had a lot of stuff going on. And I want people to understand this. Grover being the first true scientist, anthropologist that had the courage, and I mean courage, to speak out and step up and say, there's something going on here, rest of the science world, and it needs to be explored. And that was a bold thing. And I'm sure some of you folks in the audience have probably heard, he had a lot of challenges. He received a lot of ridicule. There were just a lot of things that had happened to him. And it was unfortunate that I don't know if he ever made full professor, as an example, but really good guy. And he did the right thing.
Give us an example of the Bossburg trackway and his involvement in that.
Sure. Yeah, I will. So that's that's a very interesting situation. So, by that time, in 1969, up in the very northeast corner of Washington State is a little, actually, I think it's a ghost town now, but was a little bitty community called Bossburg, Washington. It was just south of the Canadian border. And there was a trackway that was discovered there. I lost you guys, by the way, on my screen, but can you guys see me okay?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I'll hold something up. So there was a trackway that was discovered there by a couple of fellows that was a sentinel, I'll call it, experience for Grover. So keep in mind, and this was in December of 1969. So the Patterson-Gimlin footage was roughly 2 years old at that time. And just to digress a little bit, the Patterson-Gimlin film, if you haven't really read much about the history of that whole thing, there was a lot of controversy, let's just put it that way, about its authenticity. And Grover had gotten somewhat involved in that. And at that time, I think he was somewhat skeptical. I think he was leaning to the fact that it was authentic, but he wasn't sure. And there was a lot of stuff going on. And then all of a sudden, 2 years later, this trackway was found called the Bossburg trackway. And so I had the pleasure of, talking to Grover, not too many years after that, when we got introduced in the early 70s. One of the first things he talked to me about was, and it was the trackway that convinced him that this creature is real. And I'll explain it to you a little bit more right now, but it was a trackway in a very remote area. And we're not talking single track, folks. We're talking 1,089 tracks. that the investigators and people that got into all that at the time were able to follow this creature where it went up a ridge line, came back. There was a river there, it crossed fences, all kinds of stuff. Now, again, I always like to tell people this is in a remote area. So, we are always concerned, especially in today's day and age, about hoaxers and stuff like that. But when Grover went up there and got involved in the investigation, he told me that was it for him. He was solid. He knew this creature existed. So I'm going to hold this up and hopefully you can see it. But this was the left foot of that creature, okay? And this is about 17 and a half inches long and 7.5 inches wide. But the real kicker is what would have been the right foot of the creature. And not a lot of people have ever really seen, I don't think, a casting of this. You've probably maybe seen it in one of the books or something, but this is the right foot of the creature.
The crippled foot.
This is the crippled foot. So now step back, and there's a whole science in being able to re-engineer a creature that would have feet of this size, of which Jeff Meldrum, as an example, is a world renowned for that. But there are others that have those capabilities. But in my conversations with Grover over the years about it, ask yourself this: why in the world would you ever, if you were hoaxing something, ever do one with a crippled foot? And secondly, if you wanted to do that, why would you put it in some really remote area where the chances of it ever being discovered in the first place are virtually slim to none? And the interesting thing about it is when they really started to examine the cast, and it's been examined quite a bit. I know Dr. Meldrum's examined it himself quite a bit, and others. You find out that the person, if they were to have faked this, would have had to be an expert in podiatry, in the construction of a primate's ankle, how it comes into the foot. You would had to have supreme knowledge to even be able to construct something like that, because in reality, this proportionally is exactly what you would expect an 800-pound, 7.5-foot creature, crippled foot to look like. And it's just an amazing story. And I think we've got to link up, Larry and Mark, that folks that are listening can click that on, or certainly look up the Bossburg, Washington sighting of 1969. That's BOSS, Bossburg. And it's one of the most remarkable trackways, I think, ever. And it solidified Grover's belief in this creature, and he never doubted it after that.
We have a video clip that your wife Linda shot,
right,
when Dr. Meldrum invited y'all to his lab.
Yeah.
And in this clip, he talks about the Bossburg trackway.
That's right, Mark.
So
let me just say one thing about that, so the audience understands. So Lynn and I actually were on one of our road trips out west. We have family members that live now out in Washington State, and actually I think my daughter Rebecca and her husband Greg and 10-year-old son that lives in Port Ludlow, Washington, I think might be listening to the broadcast. But 3 of my children live out in Washington State. All of them live in the North Olympic Peninsula area. And we were on our way out to do a visit at one time. This was in 2012 at that time. And we had stumbled into the little town called Montpelier, Idaho, in the southeast corner, right along the Wyoming border. It was getting dark. We'd been bouncing around. We actually had visited a recent Bigfoot site not too far from that little town. But we were one of the types that we always just kind of freelance. We don't try to make too many plans. We just go with the flow and take the back roads and stuff. So we pulled into this little town, stopped at a mom and pop hotel, and checked into the room and realized, it was getting late, small town. We better go get something to eat for all the restaurants closed. And as it turned out, we're driving down, and some folks that may be familiar with that town, they have a little museum in this town. It's called the California-Oregon Trail Museum. But on that particular evening when we drove by, not even knowing it was there was this massive poster banner on the outside. And the reason that of a Bigfoot, and the reason that was there is Dr. Meldrum had put an exhibit in there that he had left there for about a month or two. And I saw it. Of course, the museum was closed, but I told Linda, we're not leaving town until we go to that museum in the mornings. So, which we did. And so in the morning, we went through his exhibit, and I ended up saying, hey, we're gonna detour a little bit. I called Jeff on the phone, and luckily he was, in Pocatello at that time. And I said, Jeff, we'll buy you breakfast. And so we actually had breakfast with Jeff at his famous place called Elmer's, and just off the campus, and visited with him for about an hour and a half. And my biggest dream came true. He invited Lynn and I to come up to his lab. And so that's a good lead into where we were. But this was all unplanned. And we were in his lab for a couple hours. Linda had the foresight, thank goodness, to pull out her cell phone and ask Jeff if, she could take some pictures and maybe do a few little video clips. And the gracious guy that he was, no problem with that. And so this clip is one of those little clips.
Okay, we're going to play this clip now.
Yeah, here we go. So here, you can take, I want you to take these with you as well. Here's the Bossburg pear.
That's the pear.
And so, and this is a, it's a stunning, in fact, when take yours and compare it to the normal, the healthy foot. Mm-hmm. And, I was sitting there, I was doing an interview, and as they're setting up, adjusting the lights or whatnot, I had these two cats sitting here side by side. And I'm looking at these, into just the superficial glance, they look, like apples and oranges. But when you start really comparing, mm-hmm. and in fact, it motivated me to go grab a couple images on Photoshop and overlay them, mm-hmm. and go back and forth transparent.
Right.
And the congruence between the proportions, and the shape of the distal sole pad and the configuration of the toes was remarkably congruent.
Right.
It's really quite stunning. And then again, as we've talked, the anatomy, the pathology of this foot is just really quite amazing. And I've had so many interesting conversations with orthopedists and podiatrists.
I do recall reading something about that a while back. Was there not a guy from Illinois?
Yes. Russell Meldrum was my cousin, I think he's now in Illinois. My second cousin.
Okay.
And he's an orthopedist. And yeah, we had a really interesting conversation because I had sent him a photo of these, of the originals, and the photo had a couple of yardsticks lying in the image.
Right.
And when he saw this, he was really quite enthusiastic, and he said if he had evaluated a patient with a unilateral presentation of this abnormality, he would suspect a spinal cord lesion as one possibility, that the neuropathy can cause the contracture and hypertrophy of the tissues and so forth. He said, when and where could you maybe check with some of the hospitals in that region and see if. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, maybe I could, but the guy'd have to have 17.5-inch feet.
Yeah.
And there was a silence, and he goes, oh, that's right. And about 2 weeks later, I got a call from his boss, who was the head of the group, and he was the foot specialist. He'd been out of town. When he came back in town, he showed him these things. And so we talked for a good hour and a half about the pathology and everything. And then he said, I hope you don't mind. I framed the photo that you sent, and it hangs in my office. And every time I take a new set of residents on rounds, we stop and I have them evaluate this case.
Doug, that had to have been an amazing experience to have that one-on-one time with Dr. Meldrum in his lab.
It really was for me. I mean, it was, first of all, here's a man that's pretty high profile in many communities, scientific communities, and certainly probably today one of the most, probably the highest profiled from a scientific aspect And it was just a thrill for Linda and I, and he couldn't have been more gracious. And, obviously I'm, very indebted to him for that opportunity. We really appreciated it quite a bit, but, only Jeff can explain things. And I know he gets into the morphology of the foot and, started to mentioning some of the pathology of the spinal column that could have caused that club foot to happen and all that. That starts to get over my, pay grade real quick, but he's an amazing guy. He's an educator and he's a teacher, and he can explain things to the average Joe like myself to a point where at least we can appreciate what he's talking about. And it's pretty amazing when you really look at that cast. And I hearken back, and I would tell anyone, just ask yourself that question. And there are some other examples we'll touch on here in a little bit, but of all the casts that have been, poured by field researchers all over this North America over all the decades, all the sighting reports, all the stories, ask yourself, 1,089 footprints of a crippled walking over 5 foot, taking one step right over a 5-foot fence. I mean, stride lengths, the whole 9 yards. Who would do that?
Right.
Nobody would do that, So if you think that's a hoax, then I'm buying you a beer, because no way.
Larry, me and you talked about yesterday and the angle that you took about Dr. Meldrum. I would really like for you to elaborate on that, because that was a fantastic point.
Well, I told Doug this also. I mean, as much information as Dr. Meldrum shared in that video, what struck me the most, besides he took the time to meet Doug and Linda for breakfast and to bring them back to the lab, I mean, his enthusiasm for sharing the knowledge of those footprints. This wasn't a video that was shot for TV. This was just Doug and Linda shooting it for their own personal memories.
That's exactly right.
And his enthusiasm was just as high there as any interview he's done on any show. And that struck me as an amazing fact right there.
Yeah, no, you're spot on that, Larry. I'm very fortunate, and I know Linda feels very fortunate that we call him a friend, and we're pretty guarded with our time. I will tell you this: before I release these little clips of ours, I've always told Jeff, look, I'm in this for the knowledge and stuff like that. I would never toss your name around, for any particular personal gain on my part. I keep our conversations are relatively to ourselves for the most part. So I asked Jeff before I released, these and some other photos if he had a problem, and I knew he wouldn't. And he wrote back, absolutely not, Doug, you go ahead, no problem whatsoever. And that's just the kind of guy he is,
Yeah.
Well, we're showing some videos right now that Linda shot from there. And if you will check out in the comment section, I have them pinned, the links, and you can actually go and watch these 5 different videos that Linda shot. If you're interested in hearing more of what Dr. Meldrum says about what he was showing Doug and Linda. And it's a great gift. And I just really appreciate, first of all, Dr. Meldrum allowing us to show this, and for Doug to share it with us. It's just...
Definitely.
I have to tell you this, I give a lot of credit to my wife, because I was so excited talking to Jeff, it didn't even dawn on me. I mean, man, we were drilling down. It was keep in mind, you got 5 relatively short clips. We were there for 2 hours in that lab. It was a whole lot of fun, I can tell you. I'd have paid a whole lot of money for 2 hours with Jeff in his lab. Cost me a breakfast.
A lot of people would. I guarantee it.
All it was is a couple, sunny side up eggs and some bacon.
That's a pretty good deal.
Yeah, he's a great guy.
Well, Doug, I'm going to tell you, I feel the same about you and Linda.
Thank you.
It's an honor to be able to call you a friend.
Well, I appreciate that.
And I don't know, you're just such a nice man, and Linda is such a nice lady, and you just want to share this knowledge and the things that you have learned over 50 years with anybody that's willing to absorb it.
Yeah, that's true, Mark. And, I feel that I've been very fortunate. Some of it was planned efforts on my part over the years. Others, who would ever thought my professor at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana would have known Grover Krantz? What's the odds of that happening? But it happened, and it's just kind of one of those stories. And, it was through Grover that he had mentioned, Peter Byrne and what Peter was going to do when he got out of the Himalayas and wanted to open up that information center, Bigfoot Information Center, just outside the Dalles. And, it just kind of one thing led to another. And in that regard with Peter was every bit as gracious, just a great guy. I've never seen him since. I know he's been at some conferences, but quite honestly, I never felt very compelled to go to very many conferences. I have gone to a few. The one that we talked about earlier, Mark, in Arkansas. I went to Craig Woolheater's conference a couple of years ago down in Jefferson, Texas, which I felt highly, that's just a tremendous, I enjoyed that so much. And actually Jeff was presenting at that time. So that was a lot of fun to see him. And honestly, Linda and I had just seen him. We were on another one of our trips out west, and we made a point of going through Pocatello and had planned ahead of time and just said, "Hey, Jeff, I've never met your wife." It's a second marriage for Jeff. And I said, let's just get together, Lynn and I, and you and your wife. And I promise we won't bore her talking about Bigfoot. We'll just go to someplace. Of course, the girls talked, all the girl stuff, and Jeff and I got right into the Bigfoot stuff. But I saw him then, 6 weeks later down in Jefferson, Texas, and spent the whole time there pretty much with him. But he's a great guy.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to the Four Horsemen of Sasquatch a little bit. You talked about Grover Krantz and Peter Byrne.
Right.
Tell how you link in anything with John Green or Renee.
Yeah, I can do that. So, and I want to put this in the proper context because, whenever you talk about going back to those days and the men of that era, and you realize now of those four individuals, only one is still alive, and that's Peter Byrne. And I say that with all due respect. So before I talk a little bit more about those guys, I want to make sure people understand there were a lot of other key players by the dozens back then. Yeah. But I don't think, as Mark had suggested, as well known for one reason or another. But these four individuals were pretty amazing guys. So John Green was a newspaper guy out of Harrison Hot Springs, British Columbia. And he was one of the very first guys also. That's a hot spot for Bigfoot sightings, over the centuries actually up in that area. And being a newspaper guy, he would often write articles and stuff. But he was one of the first guys that got involved, even with the Jerry Crew casts in the 1950s. And then definitely was involved with the Roger Patterson Gimlin film and other things. So he became a very active investigator. And I wish I knew the answer to the question I'm going to pose. I don't know what happened. I'll have to ask Jeff, but I sure hope that someone has all his research, because I know, did well over 3,000 interviews and investigations during his lifetime. Unfortunately, he passed on here not too long ago. He wrote a number of books. He, gave talks at conferences and things like that. In 2003, one of the things that happened, we had the opportunity to meet him. It was the only time actually I ever met him. And that was a great experience for Lynn and I as well. It was actually the same time I met Jeff, but a terrific guy. So he was one of those pillars. Yeah. So you owe it to yourself, if you're serious about this subject, to Google his name. Thank God we have the internet and Google, and do a search and read about John Green. There's so much posted about him. The other guy that we've mentioned, Peter Byrne, and we've mentioned Grover, but the other guy was a guy named Rene Dahinden, and Rene was also Canadian, and of a little different background. I don't want to say anything and give people the wrong impression, but I would just say kindly that he was not an overly sophisticated guy, but he was a guy who was just dogged in his desire for knowledge. He was absolutely into investigating any information that he got on this subject. And so those four guys for, 20, 30 years solid, they were really the guys that brought all of this to the forefront. And it was through their efforts. I was just actually thinking about this morning. I can't even imagine where we would be today if it wasn't for someone like Grover, as an example, who put it all out there, risked his career to advance this and start chipping away at getting the other scientists in the community, including a young Jeff Meldrum, who entertained that. A guy like John Green, through his connections through the media, through print media, and the willingness to put out stories so people, maybe get picked up by the Associated Press or the United Press or something like that, and spread a little bit around North America. And of course, Peter Byrne was a famous, big game hunter from, British fellow. And then, you had the overflowing personality of a guy like Rene Dahinden. And, those are the guys that really were on their shoulders today.
I couldn't agree more. Larry, do you have any thoughts on? I can't even imagine rubbing shoulders with these guys, and especially back in the day, and and to be able to, as you view new evidence, one thing that we usually say, our little small group, the more that we learn, the more that we realize that we don't know anything. Right. And for people of science to be able to look at evidence and then see new evidence, which leads them to follow the scientific path of this creature. It's just amazing.
That's good. You're right. Yeah. I mean, it's, I'll back up just a little bit. I know we got a little bit off our agenda here, ahead of ourselves, and regress a little bit. But so back in 2001, I had always been wanting to get up to Willow Creek, California, and try to go up to where the Patterson-Gimlin film sighting was. So my wife, Lynn, and I, we were on another one of our jaunts out west to see some family and stuff. Of course, we always would incorporate rock and mineral and fossil and Bigfoot sighting stuff. That's what we did, and so I told Linda, I said, we spent the night, I remember, in Eureka, California. I said, the next day we're gonna drive up to Willow Creek. And I'll never forget that drive. I've been around a lot of woods and a lot of places in Minnesota and my working career and all over the place. And I had been in the forests of, Washington. I've been up to Washington and Mount Rainier many times. But boy, I'm going to tell you something. When you leave Eureka and you drive west, I don't remember that highway's number, you get into some heavy forest. But more importantly, you get into very steep ridge lines of forested mountains. And I remember driving up there, and I can't remember, I want to say it's 45 miles east of Eureka. You're in the middle of the wilderness. And I remember saying, a man could not walk up those slopes.
Yeah.
You could maybe do it on your hands and knees by grabbing each sapling and pull yourself up. And that's the area, when you think about it, where Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin on horseback, it was actually north of there, but it's the same terrain. And they were going along, for the most part, the riverbeds. I totally understand why they were doing that. I don't think a horse could go through that. The growth was thick in the first place, and it was so darn steep. It was, I had not at that time ever seen anything quite that remote and steep. But I really wanted to get into the town of Willow Creek, and they have a little museum there called the Willow Creek China Flat Museum. And one of the characters in the whole, not characters, but one of the gentlemen in the whole Bob Gimlin, Roger Patterson film was a fellow named Al Hodgson. And if you haven't, heard much about Al, he's unfortunately passed away now too, but he ran a business there in town, and he was somewhat of the curator. It's a small town. I don't know at that time. I don't think it's much bigger today, maybe 2,000 people. I doubt it's even that many, but he kind of the curator of this little museum, and it was pretty small, about the size of a double wide trailer, honestly. And I wanted to get in there because I had read somewhere in a little article that some of the original castings from the Patterson Gimlin film were in there. And I knew that Al was involved in that, and some of the original newspaper articles from that area were in there. So of course, me thinking I'm going to a much bigger community, libraries and museums are open Monday through Friday, not in Willow Creek, it's all closed up. But I told Linda, I said, honey, I'm not leaving town unless I make the best effort I can to get in and take a peek at those casts. So I made a couple quick calls, and I had a really sweet, nice elderly lady. I wish I could remember her name, but I can't. And I told her my whole story. I was basically begging if she had a key, and she said, well, I don't have the key, but I know Al Hodgson. I'll give him a call. And I'm sure, after I tell him you came all the way from, at that time I was down here on Kentucky Lake, or up in Northwest Indiana, and lo and behold, here comes Al Hodgson like 10 minutes later, introduces himself, opens the place up. It was awesome. And he had a lot more stuff in there than I thought. And it was Al who told me that one of their plans, and it was kind of a fundraising event, they wanted to, for tourism purposes and historical purposes, they wanted to expand that building. Well, believe me, they needed to, because it was very small. And they wanted to make, part of it like a Bigfoot museum, which it is today. And this was, again, now in 2001. And he said one of the things that they were in the planning stages of, they wanted to host an truly international symposium of scientists to come to Willow Creek. And I said, wow, Al, that would be awesome. If that ever happens, I'm coming, and of course, at that time in 2001, Bob Gimlin had, gone into, I don't want to say hiding, but he was not making any public appearances because of all the things he had gone through and the ridicule. And sure enough, Al had sent me a note about a year later and said, hey, mark it on your calendar. In September 12th through the 14th of 2003, it's going to happen. The biggest building we got in town was a school that had a pretty small cafeteria auditorium, and they pulled it off. And when I found out from Al who all was coming, I mean, you couldn't have, I'd have had to have been locked in prison in solitary confinement to keep me from going, because they had the two Russian scientists were coming over. They had just about anybody who was anything in that field at that time was there, including Dr. Meldrum. And that's when Lynn and I first met Jeff. And we ate, it was almost a 2.5 day deal, and we ate dinner with him a couple times there and lunch, and we met Jimmy Chilcott, which we can, if we have time, we'll mention him a little bit, and others, and it was a wonderful experience. And so just great guys, great experience.
Doug, I would like to spend a few minutes picking your brain about Miss Bobby Short.
Oh, yeah.
And Mrs. Short's legacy
Right.
will always be her extensive collection of materials that she posted to her website, BigfootEncounters.com.
Yeah,
That she created back in 1995. And thankfully, it is still online. What can you tell us about Miss Bobby Short and the things that we can still learn from
absolutely.
her work?
Yeah, that's great, Mark. And I know we've been kind of talking about a lot of different things here, but she's one of the most outstanding in the field ever. Even to this day, unfortunately, she passed away in 2013 at an early 70s, to the surprise and chagrin of many people. But Bobby had one of the most, in my opinion, probably the closest and high quality personal encounter with a Sasquatch of anyone that I've ever heard of or read. And I think we have posted on the page, one of the podcast interviews of her that people can listen to when they visit back to the page, because it's an outstanding, it's a really an outstanding discussion of what her experience was. And, I'll just do a quick rundown on that. Basically, she was up in the Sierra Nevada mountains with a group of about 12, 14 people, some guys and gals, I think husbands and wives and boyfriends and girlfriends, kind of a thing. And this was in 1985. And early in the morning, she got up and she had to relieve herself. So she describes walking up into the woods above the camp, about 60, 70 yards, I think is what she had said. And she was kind of finishing doing her business. Nobody else was really up yet. It was just kind of breaking. It was just early dawn. Visibility was good, but, most folks were still sleeping. And just as she always describes, I was pulling up my britches. She sees a little bit of movement out of the corner of her right eye, and it was down the slope about 30 yards. And so she turned her head to look, and as she would describe it, she sees this figure that was pretty good size, about 6.5 feet tall. And she said at very first glance, she actually thought maybe it was one of the other campers that she hadn't noticed, but she quickly realized, oh my gosh, this is not any of the campers. And this thing was looking right back at her. And it started to walk directly towards her up the incline. And as it got closer and closer, Bobby realized this was not human. And she also realized that it was a female. She describes it having pendulous breasts. It literally walks within, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, she said she probably could have put her arm straight out and maybe brushed its shoulder as it walked by. And one of the things that was so unique about it, and she's been asked this many, many times, and this leads into some theories, Larry, you and I talked about the other day about infrasound, but she had no fear whatsoever. And that always amazed me, because I thought, holy smokes, that would be an experience. And yes, she always describes it as no fear. This thing never made any threats to her. They had eye contact the whole entire time, and it literally walked within a few feet of her and kept on going. And that's just what happened. So you can imagine now, when Bobby goes back to camp, she's like just beside herself. And she people are starting to wake up. The others that, weren't up yet got up pretty quick when they heard her excitement and all the conversation going on, so on and so forth. And I'm just going to generalize here, but for the most part, nobody believed her. They just thought, oh, Bobby, come on, you must, we've all heard it a million times. It had to be something else. Well, no, it wasn't anything else when they almost ran you over,
Right.
There's no doubt about it. And the point I'm trying to make is that from that point forward, this changed Bobby's life. She was a nurse, I believe, in Sacramento. She was a highly educated woman, and spent a lot of time outdoors. That was a recreational thing for her. But the point is, it changed her life forever. And as so many people that have close encounter and sighting experiences, you'll find over, the decades that I've been involved in reading and talking to people, almost everyone has a very similar reaction. And so she went on an absolute quest to try to have a sighting again. And she did find, some friends and some gal friends. And it reminded me of Sisters of the Moon, because I remember when I first heard about Sisters of the Moon and Debbie and some of those people. And it's one of the reasons actually why I reached out to Debbie, because Bobby was one of the first, the only other one that I can recall anyway, that were a group of gals that went up into the Sierra Nevadas. They were friends of hers trying to have that experience again, which she never did have. And then finally, when the internet really kind of was coming into vogue back in 1995, and she'd been 10 years of her life dedicated every free minute she had being up in the wilderness, she kind of realized, look, I'm getting older. It's getting harder. I got a divorce. My husband couldn't take it anymore. He was kind of no longer too important on the chain of things in her life. I'm saying that a little bit facetiously, but you know how that is when you've had something like that and you're just on this total quest. So she had the inclination then is we need to have, now that we have this great new tool, we need to have a way to coalesce all of these articles that are popping up here, there, even around the globe. So she created this, free newsletter where she never made comments, but she would send out, if you signed up for her free email, she would once a month have all these articles, links to all these articles. It could be from anywhere, anything related, even things about Neanderthals, whatever. If it was related in any way to primate evolution or the possibility linked to Bigfoot or Sasquatch. And then, so she had that, she offered that for free. And then at the same time, she built, I believe it was the very first database. And she had help, obviously, but this consumed a major portion of her life until she actually passed away. So that was the birth kind of behind Bigfoot Encounters. And, I remember the day that I went on Bigfoot Encounters and her grandson had posted that Bobby died. That's how I found out. It broke my heart for lots of reasons. And thank God. And I think his letter is still up. So people that want to read that, he at that time had told everyone what had happened, that she had passed away. He wasn't sure if, he was going to keep the site alive. And thank God he did. It's still up. I actually drilled down into it. And I would tell you that if you want to go and see the Bossburg, all the reports about the Bossburg trackway, it's all there and it's really good. And she's got it all captured, but she's got it all. So that one site, you can go back and you can go way back in history and get yourself caught up pretty quick. It's pretty awesome.
That's I remember when I first decided that I wanted to get into Bigfoot, and I hate the word research because I don't really consider myself a researcher, but that was one of the first sites that I ever came across, and you could literally spend a year on that site and not cover everything and all of its content on there.
Absolutely. I can remember in some communication with Bobby that I had through the internet saying, "Oh my gosh, Bobby, you could have saved me 25 years of research in the library," you know, because she had it all. It was amazing. I don't know how she pulled it off. Like I said, I do know she had help. I don't know how many people, but I mean, it was all there. Everything that I had spent, literally decades trying to, drill down and find out on my own. I mean, it was pretty much all right there. And to her credit, I mean, she's one of the real pioneers. That's why, to a certain degree, I hate to say, and I tried to preface it, it wasn't just, Grover Cranson, Peter Byrne, and Renee DeHinden and John Green. Absolutely, they were pillars. But people like Bobby Short, they're right there. There were others, very critically important. In my opinion. And I would say this too. I think when I reflect back on those years, that was really, I believe, the genesis of so much of what exists today via the internet, websites, podcasts. It just exploded. People, we got, and not too long after that, we got cable television and all those kinds of things, and Discovery Channel and history. And boy, lots of stuff just really started happening. And as we had talked a little bit before, I know Larry and Debbie and I had talked about this just recently, with all of that, there's some good and there's some bad. And I would say this, that the good, it really raised the awareness throughout the world, for certainly here in North America, that there were a lot of sightings that people were seeing. And obviously, a lot of sightings are misidentification. Unfortunately, a lot of them are hoaxes. But even when you ferret through all of that stuff, you have hundreds of really solid sightings that you can't explain, that from people that are highly credible, state police, conservation folks. I mean, just all kinds of folks that have everything to lose by coming forward and nothing to gain. And you realize there's a phenomenon that's taking place here. And then if you're a guy like me and you had the history that I had, and you believe in the, no one in their right mind would have ever thought about faking a crippled footed Bigfoot in the middle of the wilderness where no one could find it. I mean, right. I was long before convinced on stuff like that, but it was those efforts that Bobby Short really did that has, kind of catapulted all of us to where we are today.
All right, Doug, are you ready to talk about another subject, or do you want to talk about Bobby some more?
Let's talk what we got. The next one of the Paul Freeman.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Let's do it.
All right.
Let's do it. We're back at the lab.
One of my personal favorites, besides the Patterson-Gimlin film, has always been the Paul Freeman film and the tracks. But he's always had controversy around his name for some reason, but nobody could ever pinpoint the controversy other than he always found a lot of prints. And I know you have a great story on the Freeman trackway and all that, so take it away with us. I love his story, so go ahead.
Yeah. You want me to talk about it now? Are you going to show that little clip that Jeff has? I don't know what Mark wanted to do.
Well, if you want to give a little intro, then
I will do that. Absolutely. Sure, I'll do that. So yeah, this is an interesting situation. So when Lynn and I were having breakfast with Jeff that day in 2012, and then of course when we went up into his lab, he had talked to us. One of the first questions I had asked Jeff, and I think honestly I'd asked him this before when I first met him in 2003, but I kind of wanted to have him reiterate it. I said to Jeff, I said, hey, what was there any one event that really just happened in your life that made you decide you were going to take the path that you took? And he told me the story, and what had happened was he had a lot of family up in the Spokane area. Of course, he was living down in Pocatello at that time. I think he's got several brothers and sisters, and they had a big family get together. And as you'll see in the video clip, his one brother has always been very interested in this whole subject and interested in Jeff's career, and kind of always teases Jeff, I wish I had your job, kind of a thing, you know. So Jeff kindly, says to his brother, he said, hey, Pullman, Washington's not that far south of Spokane. Let's go down and pop in on Grover. I'll give him a call and see if he's, hanging around the lab. So sure enough, Grover said, hell yeah, come on down, So they bop on down there, leave the rest of the family, obviously, and they were all going to head back, and Jeff and his brother would ultimately leave, that area and then go back to Pocatello as well. So they get, I'm going to paraphrase a lot of this stuff, but I mean, they get into talking to Grover, and Grover said, hey, I just got a call this morning, and this guy tells me, about this fresh set of tracks. And Grover says to Jeff, basically, why don't you guys go on down there and check it out? I can't go, but it's really not that far out of your way. It was in the Blue Mountain Range near Walla Walla, Washington. And why don't you guys just pop in on them, and I'll try to ring them up and let them know you're coming. So, oh yeah, they're awful. They're going. And Jeff had experiences. It wasn't like he was naive to the subject. He had been already working with Grover and some other people on this, but as far as being committed to a career of this exploration, this was his aha moment, if you will. And so he goes down and they knock on the door of Paul Freeman, and kind of quickly introduce themselves. And Paul says to him, hey, you guys want to see him? And of course, they wanted to see it. So that's what this video is all about. And I posed the question to Jeff in this video, and this would be, I think, a good time to roll that out now, Mark, and let people kind of hear the dialogue that took place between Jeff and I, and Linda was filming all this.
Okay, we're about to play the video.
Because, of course, what he would do is, as soon as the snow would start to melt back, he would go look along these roads. One of the real beauties of the blues in this region is the highest peak. Lewis Peak is only a little over 5,000 feet.
Okay.
You see that,
and yet they've got these deep canyons, and so they have well graded and graveled and road beds going up to the ridge lines. But then once you get up on top, there's it's just dirt. And so in the spring, when these things are still wet, they're fantastic tracking beds.
Yeah.
Plus that combined with the high content of loess, you get this really quality soil. And lots of tracks. This is why,
these are the actual photographs.
Yeah, I know. I just kind of I'm doing a little video. So I hear you talking.
Paul has, always been kind of criticized as having the Midas touch. How in the world does he get so many footprints? Yeah. Well, he's in an area that has more tracking. And see, this was kind of the situation. We're looking at a farm access road off of the gravel road, and
this is Stridling.
Well, there's one right there.
Okay.
So it was walking pretty casual right along here. But in fact, this was kind of interesting because notice that you've got left and then right angled out, left, right, left, and then right angled out. About every second step, the right was angled out 45 degrees. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, what's going on? Well, what happened, about 3 months later, that summer, took a family vacation to link up with some friends over on the Oregon coast. And once we got the kids building sandcastles, I excused myself and I went off and started following people, watching their footprints. After I got a couple nasty glances, I thought, well, this isn't a good idea. Better just look at my own tracks. And so I would be walking along, and every once in a while I would turn to check how it was. And I realized every time I turned my right shoulder,
looking over your shoulder.
Exactly.
Yes.
So what had happened was and Paul completely read this whole thing backwards. After we took him home and I turned to my brother and I says, even if these are fake, because I was very leery of this, even if these are fake, this is a fantastic opportunity. This is a great study in a hoax.
But there would be no reason for him to fake it. He didn't know you were coming.
Well, he didn't. No.
Isn't that funny?
And you never learned that.
The Freeman trackway tells us a lot of clues about the habits of this creature. And Dr. Meldrum discovered that the creature was turning around every other step and looking behind him or herself. Now, this creature is very much aware of its surroundings, and this is something that most field researchers are very aware of. And it's just amazing to me, and to give credit to Dr. Meldrum and to letting the evidence speak for itself. And because that's, I mean, if you watch a fox run, a fox will run, but they're not turning around every other step looking at what might be behind them. And so I think that really speaks a lot of the intelligence of a Bigfoot.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Mark. I mean, when we looked at the castings that he had there, and of course the photos that we were kind of scanning through that Jeff had taken that day, it was pretty amazing. And then in only the way Jeff could, he does a great job. It's the teacher and educator in him explaining, just exactly what took place. And it all really made a lot of sense. I mean, to me, it was just another one of those aha moments. And for Jeff, like I asked him in the clip, that he characterizes it, he had to make a very fundamental decision. And let's all just think about this for a second.
Yeah.
So now here's Jeff at a very pivotal point in his career. He's looking at this trackway that was obviously very fresh. He popped in on a fellow that had no idea that Jeff Meldrum was going to show up at his door. All right. So to me, there's no way that Paul Freeman was thinking hoax or anything like that. Okay. So this happens, and Jeff, as he's talked to me, in more detail about this, I mean, he talks about the hair standing up on the back of his neck when he looked at that trackway and realized that that was fresh tracks made by a living, bipedal creature, that probably walked through there not too, long before he actually arrived on the scene, within hours. And I think it's also very interesting, and this goes back to, defending Paul Freeman. And we talked a little bit about the jealousies, and people said, how's this guy Freeman? And Jeff talks about the Blue Mountains of that part of Washington State and the lush soil there, it's like face powder. And so in that time of the year when the snow is slowly receding and it comes off of these trails and roadways, there's a powdery dust there. It's the perfect medium to capture tracks in, and he happens to live there. I mean, it would be obvious. And, the habitat in that area is tremendous for that as well. And to me, that, and as Jeff would tell you himself, that was it for him. He had to make the decision, and he wanted to be honest and true to himself. How do I turn my back on this? I've got to pursue this. Something's there, and think of where we would be. Just think if there was no Jeff Meldrum. If there was no Jeff Meldrum that has taken us from that moment in time to the guy that we know today that spends a tremendous amount of his weekends and stuff off from his normal duties to take the time and to get into the wilderness and do the things that he does, and then to do all the speaking engagements. Just think where we would be if he wasn't involved and he had made that other decision. You talk about pushing the envelope of scientific knowledge. And I do want to say this, because Jeff has told me this so many times, and I believe this myself. And this is why, people like, the Sisters of the Moon and yourself and Mark and, Vicky and Dan and all the folks, that you guys do spend a lot of time with, and the others I know that are listening to the broadcast, guys like Dave Sciotti down in Florida that does a lot of research with his group in the Green Swamp area. You look at guys like Craig Woolheater that has a whole lot of experience and years and stuff of investigations with the group in Oklahoma and Texas and stuff like that. I mean, those kinds of folks have benefited greatly from the knowledge. And Jeff always says that, you know, they play equally an instrumental role, because it's those people now that are out in the woods and they're doing the legwork that just one or two people could impossible to do. Even if you think your small little bit of information isn't significant, it may be, because now you're talking about bringing a piece of information to someone and they have seen it before, they've heard it again, it clicks with them. It may not click with you, but they've been at it for a lot longer time, and they go, that's significant.
Yeah.
You know, this is just another, you know, linchpin of evidence. And he praises people to do that and encourages people all the time. Jeff would be the first one to tell you, you know, you don't have to be a scientist. Just be smart about what you're doing. Try to eliminate all the possible knowns before you even think about the possibility of it being a Sasquatch or something like that. And I know you guys do that, of course, but it's pretty amazing. It really is.
I agree with that. The scientific community with people like Jeff just bring the credibility to the people like us that are out there in the field, because they look at it from a scientific standpoint and can prove it to the scientific world that it is so.
Right.
Where we're just discussing a sighting or a find in the wilderness.
No, that's exactly right, Larry. I mean, you're exactly right. And you know, if you take it and broaden it a little bit, and we know this from, you know, those of us that, you know, eat up all the shows, you know, that are on history and discovery, and where Jeff has been involved in a lot of those. You realize that if you look at Jeff to a certain degree as the second wave, you know, maybe Grover being the first and now Jeff's the second. Look at the people just from the programs we've seen on TV, from the scientific background that he's brought in, you know, Todd Disotell, the geneticist, DNA expert out of New York City, you know, professor from Minnesota, and worked with John Bindernagel, discovered, you know, and developed a relationship with John Mayenzinski. There's another, in my opinion, guy that's rock solid, you know, and he's brought a lot of people in like that, and it's been great.
You know, I think about, you have a lot of people that are closed-minded and have blinders on, but this mystery has so many pieces to the puzzle, and it would be foolish for us not to look at what each person brings to the table. And I just think about, like, Dr. Meldrum reaching out to a foot specialist, and with that club foot saying neuropathy could have very well have caused this.
Right.
And there's so many clues and so many things, and I think it's just really important for us to be open-minded, and I think about the scientists and the biologists and the researchers. They have put their reputations on the line, and just with, like, Dr. Krantz, that, you know, it has hurt him professionally back in the day. And I think that as a community that we ought to be appreciative and give gratitude to these people that have this science education, and give them the gratitude and take that information and use that for our benefit in the field.
Absolutely, Mark. I mean, I think that's well said. And let me just add on to that. You know, I'll give you just a little example. We all know the history of Grover and how his research impacted his career. It hasn't been easy for Jeff, I will say that. And I don't want to speak for Jeff and his career, but I know that he's had some challenges in that. He has certainly, had his share of ridicule, his difficulty in getting really fine work recognized. He's spoken about this, I know, at conferences and things like that. But I always want to give a shout out, and actually, kind of just wrote a letter one day to the president of Idaho State University. I've been involved as alumnus at Ball State, stayed involved for many years, and I know how university structure, especially large state universities, work. And I give credit to Idaho State University and to that president for allowing Jeff to do the things that he has done, and for that institution of higher education to welcome someone on their staff to push the envelope, question scientific dogma of the day, and Jeff does that. He does it in a very credible way, and I give that university a lot of credit, because I will tell you right now, there's not a lot of universities that would allow that to happen. They would handcuff them, or whatever you want to say, and they would not allow that to happen. But Idaho State has, and I give them a lot of credit.
You have spoke earlier of Jimmy
Chilcutt, yeah.
Chilcutt, and being a fingerprint expert. Would you like to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I can do that real quick. And it's a very interesting story, and I'll try to make it real short, because I know we want to have question and answer time with folks that are online. But basically, I met Jimmy Chilcutt in 2003 at the International Symposium. At the same time, I met Jeff up in Willow Creek. And so Jimmy's background was, he's from Conroe, Texas Police Department, and he had developed a very excellent reputation as a fingerprint expert, and often testified for the FBI and things like that. And he was one of those kind of guys always trying to improve his skill set. And so he came up with the notion that, I think if I could really get prints, footprints, handprints and stuff of all known primates, maybe I could glean some things from those that would transcend over to maybe just in human prints. Maybe I could figure out a way to tell, is this person Caucasian? Are they Hispanic? Are they African American, Native American? Are they female or male? Just thinking out of the box, trying to push the envelope. But he thought that would be a passageway to do that. And ultimately, he was successful. And he's the only guy that I know, and probably still to this day, that had access. I want to say it was the Atlanta Zoo. I think it was, but I'm not 100% sure. And he was granted that opportunity. And so he developed a tremendous database. And in researching that database, he realized that when you look at these, say, fingerprints or handprints, that all these primates have a very high percentage of the same characteristics, but that in every individual species, there are one or two things that distinguish that species from any other species. In other words, it's unique to them. And that's the same that it is with, modern man. So, as Jimmy would tell you, that, he's at home one day and Jeff Meldrum happens to be on TV talking about stuff. And as I recall, Jimmy kind of telling me he wasn't really watching the program. His kind of wife had it on. He was reading the paper. And next thing I think he says, he hears Jeff say something about dermal ridges. And, that got Jimmy's attention. So he puts the paper down and listens to the rest of the program. And, next thing you know, he calls Jeff up at Idaho State and he said, hey, I think I could help you with this identification and verification, so on and so forth. And of course, you can imagine, knowing the kind of guy Jeff is, he said, absolutely, you come up, I'll pull out the best casts that I have from, Grover Krantz's, collections, and John Green and different people like that over all the years. And so he did. And Jimmy got up there and, Jeff had them all laid out, and he says, have at it. over here, work on my desk doing some stuff, and let me know what you think when you're done. And as Jimmy would tell it, and it's been depicted on one of the TV shows, I think History Channel. Jimmy's back there like 10, 15 minutes. He comes back and tells Jeff, he says, there's a great American ape walking around. And
Wow.
This is a real creature. This casting, and several of them that Jeff showed him, has features I've never seen anywhere before. Not by modern man, and I'm the only guy that's ever done this. So no one would know how to fake that.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm the only guy. And that's pretty astounding when you think about it. So, he's just an amazing guy. He again brought credibility to it. Of course, anytime you do that, there are those that are naysayers. They're saying, oh no, those dermal ridges, that's just from pouring the plaster in there and it made little lines and layer. It's not quite that simple, but you know what I'm saying. But it was interesting. I got to meet him, and that was pretty exciting and stuff too. So.
We'll take a little bit of time to talk about Dr. John Miezinski, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I don't mind that. Yeah, he's a terrific guy. Became a close friend with Jeff and stuff, and they've done a lot of field work together. John is a unique individual. I don't even know how to say it. He's kind of the quintessential man's man. Lives high up in the Wind River mountain range north, up the slope out of Lander, Wyoming. If people are familiar with that area, and there's a small little old mining town up there called Atlantic City. Lynn and I have been up there, obviously, and that's where John had made his home. But his whole career, John is my age, actually. We graduated high school the same time. So John would be 71 this year, I think 72, something like that. But he spent his whole career doing a lot of really fantastic, what I would say, unique things if you like the outdoors. And he's well renowned and highly regarded for some of the studies that he did with grizzly bear populations and, pronghorn sheep and things like that up in the Wind River. But the way he did it is he would virtually go up into the mountains by himself. And he'd spend 5-6 months at a time up there. And he'd come down every now and then, obviously, for supplies. One of the skill sets that he has, he's an expert on wild edible food. And that's why when he and Jeff had hooked up together in some of the films that we've seen, that one of the questions has always been, there's not enough food in those altitudes to support a primate of that stature. And they totally, absolutely blew that out of the water. That is no longer a question. There's all kind of food, just in plant life, let alone salmon or deer or anything else. So, I credit John for a lot of that. But when John was fairly new in his career, I believe it was in 1972, he talks about an experience that he had. Now, this is a guy that spent a lot of time in the wilderness, vast majority of the time by himself. He knows the sounds of the night. He knows, what it is like to be pitch dark. He's not a guy that gets scared by, little things. And he talks about he was in his tent and had crawled in. It had been a very busy day. And unfortunately, the tent that he had grabbed down in Lander, as a matter of fact, I think it was his first night out or his second night out. He had gone back into Lander to get some supplies and had to grab a tent, and unfortunately had some bacon grease spilled on the side of it. And he recognized that and thought, boy, I got to be careful, because you know how bears can smell bacon grease from a real long ways away.
Right.
So, he crawls in the sack, and I don't remember exactly how much time had gone by, but the next thing he knows is he, starts to hear some footfalls and some heavy breathing. And then what he described as the snout of a bear pushing in on the side of his tent, and right where the grease spot was. So he whacks it with the back of his hand. He hears the thing go away, right? But it doesn't stay away, and it comes back, and it does it again, and he whacks it again, hears it kind of ramble off a little bit, and then, you know, comes back. Well, this time when it comes back, I think he said he has his 45 out because he was getting pretty uptight because this bear isn't going away. Well, this time when the indentation comes in the side of his tent, John whacks it, but it wasn't soft. It was real hard. And right when that happens, and it was a bright night up in the mountain there and stuff, and he could see the moonlight coming through the top of his tent, he describes this massive big hand, full silhouette, come over the top of his tent when he whacked it. And what he whacked was the creature's knee, not the snout of a bear. And when the creature turned to spin away, probably thinking his tent was something solid like a rock or who knows what, it put its hand on his tent and collapsed his whole tent and the whole 9 yards. Of course, you know, John's crawling out of there like real quick and building up his fire. And he describes how he stayed awake for a number of hours, and the creature went back and, you know, 15, 20 yards into the forest, but threw pine cones at him for the next 3 or 4 hours. But it's an amazing story, and that's also on podcast. It's on reenactment on one of the television programs that they've done. But it's really worth, I destroyed the whole story, but it's really worth listening to his account of the whole thing. The unique part of all that is that, you know, John decided, I'm getting rid of this tent. I'm coming down out of the mountain. I got to get something that's clean, you know. And so he gets back into Lander and tells his immediate supervisor what the situation was. And the supervisor said, wow, you know, we've had a rash of Bigfoot sightings all through this whole area, and I want you and this other guy to investigate. And again, I'm paraphrasing and moving fast here. So basically they go out for the next several weeks and they're investigating all these sightings that are coming into Lander, and take a lot of information, got plaster casts some more and things like that. And next thing you know, there's a meeting, all hands on deck, all the rangers and field people have to come in, and the big honcho out of Casper or Cheyenne, wherever the headquarters was, I mean, gets them all in a room and points out, you know, to John and his other guy, I don't want to ever hear that name Bigfoot again. You guys, you know, you're going to get fired. You know, I mean, he just hammered them. So, you know, for the most part, John never really got into it too much. On his own, he was always alert and stuff because he knows what he experienced. But, you know, it wasn't until he basically left that service and then started hooking up with Jeff and started doing like a lot of contractual work that he then started speaking about it again. But it's amazing. He's an amazing guy, and I would highly recommend people. I think we have a link there too, I think, Mark. So it's well worth reading and digging into.
And just to remind everybody, make sure that you check out the links that are in the comment section. And before we get to the questions, I just want to thank David Henry for tuning in. Do you know David Henry?
That's my grandson in Port Ludlow, Washington. So, by the way, guys, they are soon going to be moving to Kentucky Lake in the house right by me, and so they're going to be Kentuckians pretty soon.
I've seen that. That's nice.
Hello. Nice.
Hey, David. Glad you joined us.
He's a good guy.
And Jeff Townsend and Steve Walden did something really nice for us tonight, and you know what you did, and so we just want to thank y'all. And Larry can vouch for this. We love Jeff Townsend, don't we?
We sure do. No doubt.
We had the opportunity to camp out with him for a week, and I know every day I did the Slade Monk. I love you, Jeff Townsend, every day, because he's just a fantastic guy, and this world would be a better place if there were more Jeff Townsends. in this
No
world.
doubt. No doubt.
Larry, I guess we better get started with some of these questions if you want to start first.
All right. Jamie asked, didn't the Cripplefoot show up again later, 100 miles or so away? And he said a couple of 100 miles away, possibly, and some other casts show up a few years later.
Well, that's an interesting question. And I actually asked Dr. Meldrum that same question. And as I recall, the response was a negative to that. I'm not saying that's the definitive. What Jeff had told me when I asked is that over a couple of week period, they did find more Cripplefoot casts. I think the distances involved at that time, Jamie, were like 18, 20 miles away. And I think they were actually found by a border patrol agent because, you know, that area is right along the Canadian border. But I had not heard that it was that great of a distance away. I would tell you this, though, relative to that, and I don't think it was depicted on any of the clips that we had time to show tonight, but one of the clips talks a little bit about that. And I asked Jeff about, have you ever seen tracks, not only the same individual over greater distances, but over a number of years? And his answer to that was yes, they had. And the example he gave in that discussion is that a couple of the other scientists that he was interfacing with at that time were pretty confident that the Sasquatch probably had 1,000 square mile home range, and that they actually had identified at least one track. I think there were actually a number of them over the years where there was 15, 20 years apart, but absolutely no question it was the same individual. So that starts to give you some idea also not only of the distances traveled, but also maybe the life expectancy of those people. We really don't know what that is.
Okay, Doug. Squatchaholic asks, do you have a website and have you written any books?
You know, Squatchaholic, I have to tell you, I have not. And I don't have either one. I haven't written any books. I've always chosen not to do that. I had a pretty robust career in the steel and iron ore and mining industry. Eventually got into senior management. So, and then raising 7 kids, and now with 15 grandkids, been pretty busy. One of the things that happened here recently, I realized as I watch podcasts, as I watch some of these programs, there's a lot of new people, younger people getting into all of this. And, in conversations with Debbie Jones and Larry and Mark and people like that, it's kind of one of the reasons why we thought a broadcast like this might be helpful, because, there's a lot of stuff that happened before us, and there's a lot of information out there. I was very fortunate in the fact that obviously, there aren't a whole lot of guys like me in that time frame that ever got to meet a Grover Krantz, developed a relationship with Jeff Meldrum. So I pursued all this information pretty much on my own. I never felt compelled to want to go out there. There were with all that stuff, there's so many other people that are doing a great job, people way smarter than I am, that's for sure, that are doing incredible job, and I kind of just left that all up to them. So no, I never really have.
All right. Let me see. Jimmy Chilcutt, can you elaborate on the fingerprints regarding what he studied and the differences he saw between primates and humans?
Well, no, actually I can't. And it's a good thing that I can't. And the reason is because when you think about the potential for hoaxing,
right,
would that have been a bad situation or what? And I'm sure maybe Jeff knows and maybe a couple other folks know, but that kind of information was pretty close to the vest. I can only tell you this, that the characteristics from what I can remember in my conversations with Jimmy are relatively subtle. You would really have to understand the science behind that to try to fake it. And it's, it's one of those things that you could tell right away if you had enough, the print was high enough quality where you were picking up the dermoglyphics, stuff like that, you'd be able to tell in a heartbeat if it was a fake or not.
Right.
But I don't know if he's ever disclosed all of that for a variety of reasons, you can imagine.
I believe I've seen him talk about it on either the Discovery Channel or History Channel on one of the shows he was on. He didn't go into great detail about it, but he talked about how the human dermals were and the primate dermals were, and that Sasquatch was different in between. Right.
Yeah, he gave you just enough, man, to really make it believable, but he didn't want to spill the whole beans,
Right.
I give him credit for that.
But he did emphasize the fact that it was impossible to fake dermals unless you were diligent over a 10-year period etching them out.
Yeah, that ain't going to happen.
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Steve Walden asked, Doug, have you ever had a sighting?
I have not. And I've often reflected upon that. And I would just tell you, kind of firing from the hip, I'm kind of glad I haven't. I can tell you one thing. I wouldn't have reacted the same way Bobby Short did. I can tell you that. I cannot imagine, sure, I would have loved to have seen one, but, I've made some efforts over the years to inject myself into the deep woods. I was telling Larry and Debbie not too long ago, I did that at one time and got myself thoroughly lost. I thought I was going to be able to go out there for 2-3 weeks and kind of pretty much live off the land and not get lost. Boy, that was a big mistake, but no, I never have. I can't say that I really, it'd be pretty nerve wracking. That's all I can say. A guy that I really like, I've never met Derek Randalls, and I know Shane Corson was on the program. I was pleased to listen to that podcast. And that's one group, by the way, I got to give a plug for, because I love what they're doing. I think they're really solid guys. Again, I've never met any of those folks. I know a couple people on that team, but that's about it. But the Olympic project's a tremendous project that they've got going, and it's, bore a lot of fruit. But Derek Randall's his sighting that got him into all this, that's has also been depicted, and Derek spoke about it. I'll get your attention. I'd have been more like a Derek Randalls. I'm heading down the mountain. I'm getting out of Dodge.
Yeah. And about 100 yards into your trip, remember you got a revolver in your backpack and pull it out.
That's right. Yep.
I understand that.
Yep.
All right. Do you have or have heard of an estimate of the number of Sasquatches that may be in existence?
Yeah, I have actually. There's a scientist that actually worked with, I believe, both Grover and Jeff at one time. And by golly, I'm going to butcher his name, but I want to say it's something like Werner Fehrenbach. I've never met him. And what his actual specialty is, I don't recall what it is. But let me just put it this way: he has the background where he can take known populations, and this guy's done it with a lot of different species, and they can make estimations on what a population would be by certain criteria that they use. Sometimes it's observational, sometimes it's not. But anyhow, Werner's the only one that I know of that ever did that, and I actually was looking for that report because somewhere in my files I have it. And I will tell you this, if I do find it here in the next few days, I'll make sure we post it on the site, because it's a good read. It's a little tough to read. It's pretty analytical, but if you take your time and go back over what they're doing to come up with the numbers. But he estimated, I believe it was no less than 2,000 or 2,500 for the species to sustain itself. But then on the top side, he felt in North America, he felt the population probably would not be much greater than 10 to 12,000. And that kind of makes sense to me. I think I could believe that.
Squatchaholic just wants to thank you for coming on the podcast tonight. He says this is the best podcast that he has seen. So we thank you, Squatchaholic, for that comment, and I will thank you for Doug for saying that. And your grandson, David Henry, wants to ask Larry a question.
Uh-oh.
Has Larry had a sighting?
David, I have not had a full-blown sighting. I've had a lot of encounters, heard vocals, I've smelt them, and heard them walking around, but I have not physically seen one.
Yeah, you know, Larry, we're going to have to get him out in LBL because he's going to be living right across the lake.
We'll be glad to take him.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
No doubt. We'll have to buy him a tick suit, though, because they're bad.
Yeah, I know. Bad in my yard.
All right. Bama Murdoch wants to know, have you had any other experiences with Bigfoot? You've talked to the prints, but have you heard the screams, tree breaks, structures, anything?
I have a scream, actually. In Bama, I've heard a lot about you. I'd like to meet you someday. But I did hear a scream one time. Gosh, I'm trying to think how many years ago was that. I was up in the North Cascade Mountains on horseback, and out of the town of Winthrop, Washington, which is kind of near the Canadian border, up in that area. And it was from a distance. We were up in a mountaintop. And it was actually the guy who was one of the guys that was on the it was just my wife and I, Linda, and it was a trail guide, and he obviously heard it too. And it's hard to explain, but on some of the recordings that I have heard, it's similar. It's not unlike that. I mean, it's such a unique sound, and we could not tell at all how close it was because there was great opportunity for echo, and we were, at high elevation and stuff like that. But I can tell you, I'd never heard anything like that before. The only thing I've ever heard that was even close to it is some of the things that I've heard on the recordings that other people have captured.
Right.
Okay. Lane Goodspeed asks, do you know how Dr. Meldrum's current study is going with the Olympic project?
If you're referring to, is he referring to the nests and some
Probably
of that stuff?
so. Probably
Yeah.
so.
That's I haven't talked to him specifically about that, and I hate to interject, my opinion when there's not a whole lot of fact about that, because those guys have done such tremendous work.
Yeah.
On the Olympic project with the nest. And I think Shane got into that quite a bit. So I hate to even comment, but I would say this, and we were having some conversation not too long ago about it. And it really kind of goes into the whole thing of DNA analysis and genetics and all the tremendous advances that have happened here. And I mean, to a great extent, even in the last 5 years. And I will tell you this, I threw some money at getting some of the analysis of those hairs and some of the samples that were taken from those nests. And when the results came back and basically said there was human contamination on those samples, I wasn't disappointed. And the reason I wasn't disappointed is, if I'm not mistaken, it was very close to human, but not 100%.
Right.
And I've come so full circle on a lot of this that, you talk about how close we are to chimpanzees, how our DNA and our genomes and all of that. And there's only a few percentage points between us, yet we look so different. But they're, as far as we know, verifiable, they're our closest kin. Well, there's no reason to believe, and from all the things I've read and all the things that I've studied over all these years, that, possibly a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot is in between those two, maybe the proverbial missing link. Now, if that's the case, and with the technology that we have today, and we get back samples that say 99% human and not 100%, that's almost a backdoor way of saying, wow, what is this?
Right.
Okay. And I look at it that way, and it makes you want to go back and look at a lot of these samples over the years, if they're still available, of where we had situations where, there's a lot of them where it would come back and say, oh my gosh, that's a human hair, or that's a this, or that's a that, but it's human.
Right.
And it makes you want to go back and use the new technology today. And is it truly 100% human, or was it 99.5, or was it 98.9, or whatever it was?
Yeah.
Right.
I'm no expert by any means, but sure begs the question, doesn't it?
It sure does.
The only other comment I would say about that, and again, I hate to, usurp what Derek Randall's and guys like Shane and all those people that have worked so hard on that project. But when I step back, and from what I know about it, is who in the world could fake something like those nests?
Yeah.
And
Right.
why would you fake those nests in some place where no one is going to find them, and have dozens of them in very difficult terrain of that size? It just doesn't make sense, folks.
Yeah.
Right.
The
I
only
agree.
thing that would make something like that's a living pterodactyl that thought it was a bird's nest. I mean, I don't even know. But no, it's amazing to me. That's to me, that's one of the great finds of the whole subject to me.
I agree. All right. Cheryl Yeomans asks, has Bigfoot ever followed anybody home, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, if you mean home, yes, I think, I think Bigfoot is a curious creature in many respects. I know of some of the stories and things that I've read. Now I'm racking my brain here real quick to think about it, but I would say we're probably all fairly well aware of many stories over decades and decades of time when Sasquatch has been attracted to the sounds of children playing or babies crying, or seems to have some affinity for women in some respects. And I do recall reading some stories where people had felt that they were followed all the way back either to their campsite or to a lodge or cabin that was remote in the woods or something like that. So that's probably the best answer I can give you.
Right. I know one of the tactics we employ is when we set up a primitive camp out in the woods, we always, of course, we're hiking around the area researching, but they do come back to camp at night and usually interact, throwing stuff or something.
Right.
So.
Right. That's a good point. If do we have a lot of questions left? I don't want to diverge off that.
We have one more.
Okay, let's do that one first, and then I'll jump back on what I was going to say.
Okay. Thomas Potter, and I think this is an excellent question that he asked. And, of course, it's an opinion. But do you think it would be a positive thing or a negative thing for this species if Bigfoot were proven scientifically?
Well, I will tell you what I think. I think it would overall probably be a negative. Responsible. I'd say it depends on how the people who actually do the verification and in what way was that verification made. I would say to people like that, you could take and look at some of the things and the mountain gorillas, and we can glean a lot of discovery of the giant of information from that. To a certain degree, I think those were handled properly. I only say that it's one of the concerns that I have is how that would be handled. Man's got a neck, and that's that. And would say it really kind of depends on who those individuals were, how they approached it. I would hope that they did it in a very well thought out manner that was diligent, that protected the species, that there wouldn't be a whole lot of disclosure other than, an elite group of people that could observe them and things like that. But yeah, I fear the worst, honestly. I hate to say it, but I do.
You kind of broke up a little
Larry
bit.
froze there first.
Did
I?
Yeah, your video feed was freezing up a little bit. But one thing that I would like to add, that if you watch this at a later date and you have questions, then Doug is more than happy to answer your questions in the comment section. So I would just say, put your questions in the comment section, and I know Doug will be diligent with answering them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. Marquis asks, have they ever noticed that big predators like cats and bears aren't in areas with Bigfoot?
I can't say that I've ever read anything like that. I think, I assume when you're talking about big cats, you're talking about mountain lions and cougars
Yes.
and stuff like that. I can't say that I've ever read anything or even had any discussions with any of the guys about that over the year. My gut feeling would be I don't see any reason that might, happen. Obviously, I think, a Sasquatch is a very formidable creature, and I think it's highly intelligent and all of that. So I would imagine that its presence is pretty well known. And I think, just kind of a natural instinct, I don't think a cougar would want to be messing with a Sasquatch. So I imagine it would probably keep its distance and look for some other kind of prey and keep out of harm's way. So, but that's a good question. I've never really known anyone to really delve into that too much.
Well, Larry, we're well over 2 hours into this, and I could go another 2 hours because this has just been it's fascinating to listen to Doug and to just absorb the knowledge and the people that he has been able to rub elbows with. And so, Doug, we would like to give you a little bit of time to give some final comments.
Sure. One of the things that I would say that I would like to alert the listeners to, I had the great fortune on August 24th. It was on the History Channel. There was a program I just actually checked again yesterday that I just happened to catch by happenstance. And the title of the History Channel program was called Neanderthal Apocalypse. And it was one of the best programs relative to this whole subject that I've ever seen. And I'll just give you a quick down and dirty. What I learned when watching that program, which was that there had been a global initiative involving a lot of scientists from a lot of different fields. And I'm talking geologists, primatologists, anthropologists, all kinds of people. They've been trying to find out why the sudden what happened to the Neanderthals so suddenly. So in the fossil record, they're thriving, they're doing pretty well, and boom, all of a sudden they're just gone. When modern man continued on and so on and so forth. And it's always been a conundrum that science has ever been able to figure that out. And that program talks about that whole subject and the fact that they did figure it out. And I won't tell you what happened because you really should watch it. But part of what I wanted to say that just really jumped out to me was they did some comparisons with modern man, with one of the guys. They wanted to understand how different body types. So, we always have the notion that the Neanderthal was this, robust body type, very thick, so on and so forth, versus, modern man at the time was, maybe taller and a little bit leaner and stuff like that. So they found a couple of guys that kind of fit that bill. One of the things that they did is they put them in the deep freeze. It's amazing to watch what they do, and I give those two guys a lot of credit, because I don't remember how cold it was, but I know it was over 60 below zero, and they were in their skivvies all wired up, and they measured those guys' body temperatures before they went in the deep freeze. I think they had them in there for 4 minutes. It was about all they could tolerate, and they were watching and monitoring everything. The one thing that happened then when they came out, they were measuring, and you could see it on TV with the heat sensing devices they had. They could see the dramatic difference in the body temperatures of those two individuals. So the notion was that the one guy would be more what you would think a Neanderthal would have been, and the other guy was more like a modern man, which he was. And it was a dramatic difference. And to me, it spoke a lot to the ability of a Sasquatch type creature to live and thrive in cold climates and high mountain elevations and things like that. The other thing that I just was absolutely fascinated by, and it really struck me, was, so we've talked about, new breakthroughs in science and technology. We have Neanderthal skulls. And I always, until I watched this program, was under the impression that the Neanderthal wasn't quite as intelligent. I think there's lots of literature out there, and even some, some videos and on some shows that, would give you the impression that Neanderthal was a little, less intelligent than modern man. And the actual results of what they've been able to do and study totally puts that notion aside. And to the fact that they said that Neanderthal was every bit as intelligent as modern man. And then the key thing was, in looking at the skull and certain areas of the brain that control certain parts of, our body and stuff like that. And I can't remember what portion of this skull it was, but the bottom line was, and this really got to me, and those of us that have spent time in the woods at night, that this Neanderthal absolutely had superior night vision.
Wow.
And so you wonder, okay, now you wonder why Bigfoot can get around in the middle of the night so well. But it's a fabulous show. And I was hoping that, when I went to check on the History Channel prior to this podcast, that I could say, hey, here's when it's going to air, and there's no dates that are showing up. I was fortunate that I recorded it on my TV, and I've watched it now 3 different times. It's just chock full of information, but it's just an amazing story. But those two things really jumped out at me, because I've always wondered that myself. How is it they have such superior night vision, and how is it they, can manage in that kind of cold temperatures? And I think I got some insights to that,
That is amazing facts for sure. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, Neanderthal Apocalypse, it's called, on History Channel.
That's cool. Larry, do you have any final thoughts?
Oh, I just want to thank Doug for coming on here. It's always a pleasure to talk to him. He's a great person, and the Bigfoot world needs people like Doug. He can talk to the scientific world, and he can talk to us knuckle draggers out there in the woods and put all the information that he's learned from the top of the scientific chain down to us poor folks here. And David, all I want to say is, whenever you move in next to your grandfather, pick his brain. You're going to be the bridge for the next generation to come on Bigfoot knowledge.
Absolutely. That's a good idea.
Well, I don't know anything else that I can add to what Larry has said. And so all I know to do is to thank Doug for his military service and being a patriot, and just, I know I'm speaking for all of us here at Beast TV, but we all love us some Doug and Linda Schrader. We do. We appreciate everything that they have done on our Facebook page, and we just want to thank you, Doug, for coming on the show tonight.
Well, I really appreciate that. I don't know if I deserve such high platitudes, but it's been a pleasure certainly getting to know you guys, and I had a lot of fun doing this podcast, and it's the first one I've ever done, and since it was so great, I'll probably never do another one, but it's been great. I really enjoyed it a lot.
We ruined him, Larry.
Well, hopefully he'll come back in the future.
We'll have to see. Yeah, we'll have to see. No, it's been great, and I really appreciate it, guys.
Well, thank you, sir. Beast TV would like to say thank you to all of our new members on our Facebook page. We have had a lot of new members join in the past few weeks, and we really begun this page about 5 years ago to train and help people analyze audio and evidence, and it has evolved. Our page has to more than that. So if you are new and haven't checked out our files tab, there is a wealth of information that you may find beneficial to you if you are a researcher, and if you are interested in contributing to the Bigfoot community, we would be thrilled to show you our protocols in analyzing audio, and we could certainly use your help. So we just want to do a shout out and say thank you to everybody that has came aboard our Facebook Beast page. We want to thank our new subscribers and our faithful followers. Also, be sure to check out our field evidence videos. And if there are any guests you would like to see on Beast TV, post their names in the comment section, and we will sick Debbie Jones on them. Please don't forget to hit the like button and leave us a comment. And Larry and I would like to thank Debbie and Shelley for all the behind the scenes work that they do, and all of our moderators. And check out our sister channel, Beast of the Woods. That's Larry's channel. And our friends at Bigfoot Outlaws, Dixie Cryptid, Night Callers, Bigfoot Odyssey, and Hidden Existence. Thanks again to Doug Schrader for coming on this week, and we will see you again. Same bat time, same bat channel. Night, night, footers.
This has been a Sawdust production.